Kia ora, I'm Chelsea Daniels, and this is The Front Page, a daily podcast presented by the New Zealand Herald. Insurers have begun their retreat as climate change bites. Back-to-back disasters in recent years have pushed insured loss into the billions and forced tough decisions about what can still be covered. Homeowners in flood and coast-exposed areas are starting to see higher premiums, exclusions, and even the risk of losing cover altogether. AA Insurance has gone the extra mile and stopped issuing new home insurance policies in several towns entirely. So who will pay when the extreme weather keeps coming? Households, insurers, or the government? Today on The Front Page, journalist and publisher of The Kaka, Bernard Hickey, is with us to explain how climate change is reshaping insurance and what it means for where and how we live. So, Bernard, I understand that there are some places in this country where you just can't get home insurance from some providers. So, for instance, AA Insurance has stopped issuing new home insurance policies in places like Westport due to flood risk and Woodend in North Canterbury due to seismic risk. What happens when all insurers abandon these places altogether?
Yeah, then there's a massive problem for the people in that town and the town itself, because essentially it becomes uninsurable and unbankable. Now, the key thing to know here, of course, is that for most New Zealanders, the value of their home really is their financial futures. It's not just a place to live. They rely on it to potentially sell once they're empty nesters and downsize, and then use any spare equity to help them in their retirement, or maybe they buy an extra retirement property or two, often near where they live. So once a town is uninsurable, it's also unbankable. And when something is unbankable, that means it's pretty much worthless because you don't have the same competition to buy the house from people who are able to borrow money. And a good way to think about what your property's worth once it's unbankable is to imagine if it was an apartment in one of those so-called shoebox apartments where the banks had all pulled back from lending against them. And essentially they're worth nothing. So this becomes a very existentially dangerous thing for the personal finances of people living in those towns, because their houses aren't worth nearly as much. And secondly, it becomes an issue for the town itself. No one will want to move there to take up a job. Businesses will see people leaving. And of course, once you see the circulation of cash in a town slow up because you're not seeing properties being sold, then it really just shrivels. And that's what's making people very nervous when towns like Westport and Blenheim and others, they haven't lost all of the insurance. You know, this is one of the insurance companies. There is one other, which is something. And of course, then there'll be questions about whether the government should get involved as an insurer of last resort, which we have seen those debates happen in places like Miami and California, where there really has been complete insurance retreat.
Yeah, so your house is only worth as much as a bank is going to give you to, loan you to buy it, I suppose. What happens if a bank approves a loan subject to insurance and you go, great, buy a house unconditional, but then you can't get insurance?
Yeah, well, you want to make sure that it is one of those conditions on your sale and purchase agreement. But this is the thing, often you don't find out until you apply. And this is the destabilizing and corrosive thing about the problem with unmanaged insurance retreat is that people only find out at the last minute. And there's some interesting problems here where often the owner of the house will have been told by the insurer that their insurance maybe is not going to roll over, or suddenly the pricing's going to change. And then they can sell their house, but they know that whoever's going to buy it is going to really struggle to get insurance. So literally, people are receiving letters in their mailboxes, which are a bit like neutron bombs for their personal finances. Suddenly they realize not only are they going to struggle to get their own reinsurance, or it's going to cost a lot more, but they'll really struggle to sell their place if there is no insurer ready to take it up. And of course, once one insurer pulls back, the other insurer is going to ask themselves the question, do I really want to increase my risk to this particular place? So this is the thing. It's a bit like the game of musical chairs. Once the music stops, you better be sure you've got your seat on a chair, otherwise you're going to miss out. And this is the problem for insurance retreat for entire towns. Now, often insurance retreat, if the insurers are doing their job properly, is not entire towns. It's pretty rare for something like Westport to happen. What we're talking about is particular gullies, particular places that are vulnerable to slips, particular parts of coastlines, next to cliffs, these sorts of things. It's unlikely to be a blanket, everyone's out. But before you buy a house, you want to be absolutely sure that you can handle, let's say, for example, 3 degrees of warming. It's clear now that we're going to have probably 2 degrees of warming within 20 years or so. And we know from the climate scientists that means even more extreme and more frequent weather events like the Gabrielle storms. And this is the issue here for people in New Zealand, because we are so reliant on our houses for our financial futures, even more so than in the likes of the US or even Australia.
And it sounds like just all ethics go out the window when you're trying to sell your house, hey?
Well, this is a really interesting question. There's that old joke of Sergeant Schultz from Hogan's Heroes, I know nothing, I see nothing. And there'll be a bunch of real estate agents and homeowners who really don't want to know. You get to the point where if you suspect that your house may not be insurable, do you sell first and ask questions later? Because then you can't be accused of knowing something and not telling it. And that's a really interesting problem for real estate agents to follow, and also the regulators of real estate agents, because disclosure becomes really important in this case. And certainly for anyone who's buying in an area that might be in some sort of remote question, you want to make sure, A, that you don't commit yourself until you know you've got insurance, and B, it's the question you ask the real estate agent. So is this house insurable? And when they look blankly over the horizon, you've got some other questions to ask.
People who have built their homes on areas subject to liquefaction. I've seen the disaster that has caused, and those people desperately want to know whether they'll be able to rebuild, and if they can't rebuild on their sections, what the level of compensation might be for that, for their plight. I want to know why it is that the insurance companies have refused to give cover on people moving into new homes for 3 weeks. What situation does that create for people that want to sign up to their new home but know they've got to have that protection? That's something I hope that the House will be able to work with the insurance companies on to get a change of attitude.
When these things happen, so you've got the Auckland anniversary floods, you've got Cyclone Gabrielle, and of course the big one is the Christchurch earthquakes in 2011. The huge bills were footed not only by insurers, not only by homeowners, but the government. And there's questions swirling every time one of these weather events happens, is that how much, when does the buck stop? You know what I mean? So if you have a house that is uninsurable and you can't get it insured and something happens, who should or does foot the bill?
Well, that's the really hot question right now, because as you mentioned, in the Christchurch earthquake, the government did step in, essentially topped up the money that was missing from EQC. It bought out AMI insurance, essentially rescued that, and then underwrote and helped fund a big chunk of the rebuild of Christchurch. And the same again with Gabrielle. The government contributed to the buyouts in Piha and elsewhere in Auckland and, of course, in the Hawke's Bay. And that cost billions and billions of dollars. Now, the current government is saying it's not going to step up, that it can't afford to back any more of these billions and billions of dollars worth of land buyouts. Now, that is something everyone should know. I'm sort of surprised it hasn't been front page news day in, day out. And you can bet your buyout that if there was another event like Gabrielle, that the first question that the politicians will be asked is, are you really, really sure you're not going to be funding buyouts this time? Because the pain is incredibly intense for a lot of people. And you only need to see some of those people who missed out on the buyouts, who are at the sort of fringes or in the boundary of being red zoned or in another area where they didn't get a buyout, to see how tragic it is. And it again forces people who are buying homes, who already own homes, to have a look at the flood maps, ask their insurer, ask all of the insurers, do all of the research so that they are sure that if there is an extreme weather event, and not just one like they saw it, like Gabrielle, but ask themselves the question, what would the flood look like at 3 degrees Celsius? Because you're buying a home that you might be living in 40, 50 years' time. Now, 3 degrees Celsius warmer than pre-industrial times means extreme, extreme, extreme weather events. It means polar ice caps melting. It means sea level rises of meters and meters. But more importantly, the extreme, extreme weather events. And ask yourself the question, do I get flooded? Is there going to be a slip? Is the road to my house going to be cut off? What's going to happen to the entire town? And then it's a matter of who gets the information first and what they do with it. So if you find out before everyone else that your house is in danger and you can somehow sell it and flick it before someone else, every man and woman and homeowner for themselves. That's what happens when the government steps back and says, well, I'm going to wash my hands of this situation. You ask, are you really, really sure? Because the political pressure will be intense in such an event like this. But B, if you're not sure that the politicians are going to step up, then it's everyone for themselves. It is the game of musical chairs where you really jump on the chair before someone else. And that's why these flood maps are so important, why the questions to insurers are so important, why the public statements from insurers and from banks are important, because it's not just the insurers that matter here. The banks are actually quite a way behind the insurers in their process of risk analysis, of understanding just how risky their books are. And, to know, for example, that there are still houses being sold in very low-lying coastal areas, that there are still banks lending money. Ask yourself the question, will they still be lending in 5 or 10 years' time? Because if you've bought the house now and you want to sell it in 10 or 15 years' time, that's when you better be sure that the banks haven't caught up. My perception of how the insurance and banking system is connected to real estate in New Zealand is that the insurers are way ahead of the banks in a risk assessment, in building their flood maps and understanding exactly which houses are going to be in danger at 2 degrees, at 3 degrees, at 4 degrees. The banks have not done that work. And they've got some serious risks to manage. Now, just like anything, no one wants to scare the horses. No one wants to suddenly announce, right, we're going to, cut all of the homes that are vulnerable at 2 degrees Celsius. These things tend to happen in dribs and drabs and behind the scenes. They are the neutron bombs in our real estate and personal finance environment. They are the letters you get. They are the shocks you get when you're talking on the phone to the person at the help desk saying, actually, no, I can't reinsure you, or no, I'm not going to give you that loan. And that's where people need to get in ahead of these neutron bombs and make sure that their home is not subject to this potential insurance retreat, and B, if they are, that they can get out and manage to flick it onto someone else.
When you talk about the banks, though, is it a bit of a chicken and egg situation? Is it the banks loaning, or should they loan, or is it the councils consenting houses in flood-prone areas?
Wow, that's a really interesting one for new homes. And of course, we've seen a whole bunch of, shockingly to me, a whole bunch of homes that have been consented after Gabrielle. Huge chunks of houses are in flood zones. And that for me is shocking. A, that the banks lent against it. B, that there were insurers who put money against it. And C, of course, that the council decided to give the consents because, in a way, a bit like leaky buildings, there's a risk here for the council that they are stuck as the last man standing, so to speak, if there is any legal action. Then we have the let's say there is another major event and these brand new homes get wiped out. Who's going to be responsible? Do we have class action lawsuits against the councils, or is it building companies, or is it the banks? Or is it the insurers? And that's why I was surprised that, A, people went ahead with these things, and B, that the banks and the insurers and the councils hadn't put their hands up and said no. Now, everyone's under intense pressure to get houses built. Some of these plots of land next to rivers and beaches are lovely. Everyone loves a beach view or, close to a lake or, close to the river or whatever. But before you signed on the dotted line, go to the flood maps. I, for example, in the last couple of years have bought a home, and the first question I asked, in fact, even before I went to the open home, was, what does the flood map say at 3 degrees Celsius? And we only even decided to look at it after we'd seen that flood map and were confident that it was fresh and good. And after we'd called the bank and the insurer and said, what's the situation here? And in a way, you also can't trust the banks and insurers because they don't know who's going to be making that decision in 15 years' time. Everyone has to become an amateur geographer. Everyone has to look at the flood maps and make a call. Actually, that road is going to be flooded. That road could be wiped out. For example, as we've seen with these state highways on the East Coast, weeks and weeks out. And Gisborne's just had several weeks of much lower economic activity because of it. So if you're asking yourself the question, should I set up a business here? Should I buy a home here? You're not only asking about your particular property. Is it covered by the flood maps? What would happen at 3 degrees? What would happen if this river overflowed twice as badly as I've ever seen it before? But also, what happens to access to my town if that particular highway gets wiped out again? So these are the issues that New Zealanders should be asking themselves when they're thinking about property and their own financial futures, and we should be asking politicians and bankers and insurers about.
Well, in terms of, I'm going to play devil's advocate here. In terms of new homeowners, people out there buying these places, are we getting angry at the snake oil salesman, or should we get angry at the people who are buying the snake oil from the salesman and not doing their research?
Well, you don't really have anyone to blame except for yourself because a lot of this information is out there publicly. If it's not, well, then you don't go ahead with the purchase. Yes, everyone wants to sell you something. There are real estate agents, there are developers, there are even councils and mayors and councillors who want to sell you something, and it usually is something right now, and they get the cash and you get the asset, and there's no comeback often. Or if it is, it involves an awful lot of legal work or a lot of pain and grief. So you want to make sure you make the right decision, and ultimately the responsibility lies with the buyer. Buyer beware.
And people hate that though, because they always want somebody else to blame. And that's in life as well, hey. But at the end of the day, if you buy into something and it's a really bad investment, if you put, $100,000 into Bitcoin when it was, on its way down, that's kind of on you.
Exactly. And that's why I think it's worth raising these issues for everyone. Now, it's quite hard to do that, to be frank, because our entire society, our entire economy is a housing market with bits tacked on. And when you jump up and say, there's $200 to $400 billion worth of property in New Zealand that is in danger in a climate with 3 degrees of warming within most of our lifetimes, it's not a nice thing to hear. And also, it's quite nerve-wracking. And if you're your business or your political party or your company or whatever is dependent on sales continuing to go, because remember, New Zealand now doesn't really grow people's personal financial wealth through any sort of real production or exports or anything like that. Actually, it's just about whether the house value goes up. Then if the house value goes down, that's a problem for everyone, because we don't know how to do it any other way. We can't handle the truth of if house prices go down, what happens then? Particularly if it's our house that went down after someone pointed out that it's in danger in a 3 degrees warmer society. Of course, the other final problem is that somehow consumers, homeowners, home buyers, real estate agents are all letting politicians off the hook on the issue of climate change by believing somehow that addressing climate change is expensive, when we know that not addressing climate change is not only expensive, it's ruinous. So this is where these issues need to be dealt with.
Will you be able to get home insurance by 2035?
It depends on a lot. It's unaffordable for a lot of people at the moment, and some insurance companies don't cover some people in some really hazardous areas. There needs to be big structural changes to how we insure, how we protect at-risk areas.
Why has it become so unaffordable for New Zealanders?
The challenge now is climate change and how we deal with it. We've got more frequent severe weather events which are just upping the ante. Every time there's a big disaster, insurance premiums go up in order to pay for it, in order to top up the coffers for the insurers. At the moment there's lots of brands, but there's only 2 big companies that are underwriting most of the insurance policies in New Zealand, and they're Aussie based.
There's so much involved in buying a house though, hey, and it's all well and good to say, well, buyer beware, I suppose. But, it can be really intimidating and overwhelming for someone who doesn't realise. I mean, I've had a few people buy houses and I had no idea the paperwork and the checks and everything behind it. Does responsibility lie somewhere to educate people on these things and make sure that they know what they're getting into before they start that process?
Yeah, that's why you're doing a great service here in talking about this and making it available publicly. But also, governments, banks, insurers, ombudsmen, consumer-focused organisations, these sorts of public interest players should be talking about this day in, day out and making people aware. Now, on the other side of the coin, there'll be a bunch of people going, don't worry. We've had so many warnings about climate change.
She'll be right.
She'll be right. Well, tell that to the people in Piha or the people in Tairāwhiti or, the people who even now are still battling to get their money back from the house they've had to rebuild, and the insurer is still not talking to them, or the government saying we're not going to bail you out next time. It is absolutely essential to be on top of these things. If you're going to make a massive financial decision based on she'll be right, well, she won't be right. And if you're making that decision without having done the work, then it's on you. And trying to recover these things after the fact is much more dangerous and painful and awful than you can imagine. Just read all of the reports, which, the New Zealand Herald and lots of other publications have got them, about people who suddenly found themselves in a situation where the insurer won't pay, the government won't pay, and they're stuck with their main financial asset being not only sometimes worthless, but even to live in it, they're going to have to spend a lot more money on top of whatever they've got.
Well, the fact of the matter is these things, these weather events are going to become more and more frequent, especially with climate change. You've got, I'm going back to 2023, Auckland anniversary floods and Cyclone Gabrielle. They were the second and third largest ever insurance events in New Zealand, and they happened within a fortnight of each other. And 10 years after, 10 or so years after the first one. So, that's no coincidence, right?
No, and this is exactly what the climate scientists warned us, that these events, these so-called 1 in 100 year events, are going to be much more frequent and much more intense. And we know that New Zealand is particularly vulnerable because we're in the middle of a big, wide ocean, which generates weather when it gets warmer I mean, it's sort of basic science, really. The oceans get warmer. There's a lot more evaporation and water that gets into the atmosphere, and then it lands on some land somewhere and dumps. And that's what's happened as the oceans around us have warmed up. And in 2025, we saw the greatest increase in ocean temperatures in history to, again, another record high. And this is simply the world's oceans absorbing heat from an atmosphere heated up by climate emissions caused by humans. And to be frank, to hear, public figures, our former Deputy Prime Minister, now our Foreign Minister, whole bunches of political parties, good chunks of voters, many of the commenters on all sorts of things saying, she'll be right. It won't be right. And you're wrong because the climate science is right. And next time you buy a house, don't be denying climate change.
Well, what more could the government do you think? Should we have kind of, as apart from stepping in and making sure people are all right when they are uninsured, should we have some kind of legislation in place? Because at the end of the day, if you don't have any options to insure your house, I can just imagine there'll be some grifty little snake oil salesmen out there being like, oh, we will insure your house. Like those buy now, pay later kind of, that crew are probably sitting on tenterhooks for people not to have any other option, hey?
Yeah, I mean, this is where the Reserve Bank is the regulator of the insurance sector and has to think about climate change a lot. And that's something that the funders of the Reserve Bank, the government, should be aware of when they start cutting budgets for Reserve Banks and saying that climate change doesn't matter. That's the position of, for example, the ACT Party, that the Reserve Bank shouldn't have to think about climate change. Well, of course it does, because it regulates insurers. And if it allows insurers to set up and sell insurance and not have enough capital because they haven't taken climate change into account and aren't prepared for these big events, well, that's on the Reserve Bank and on essentially the government for perhaps not funding the Reserve Bank properly or not following up and monitoring its performance on those mandates. But then it's not just the Reserve Bank as well when it comes to banking and insurance. It's about the government and the councils starting to think about climate, not only emissions reduction, but also climate adaptation and climate preparedness. For example, have we thought about how strong these riverbanks are? How much are we prepared to invest? Maybe it's actually cheaper to relocate people than to build a really high stop bank. Or maybe it's cheaper to say to the people of Gisborne or whatever that, you know what, we can't afford to build this really bulletproof, gold-plated new highway that will never wash out. You should move, or whatever it is. I mean, there are debates that are happening, for example, in Westport. The last mayor of Westport was voted out because he even talked about moving the town. Well, that's because an entire town decided to ignore climate change. Well, yep, that's fair enough. But the people who actually believe in science and understand how climate works will know that a mass delusion is not a solution. And so this is where politicians, the media, public figures should be talking about the science and believing the scientists who have done the work over decades and decades and have been absolutely right when they start thinking and talking about these things. And I have absolutely no sympathy or empathy for people in public life who question the effects of climate change or the need to address it, or that things that haven't happened in front of my nose in the last 10 minutes are not real things. They are.
Thanks for joining us, Bernard.
Cheers.
That's it for this episode of The Front Page. You can read more about today's stories and extensive news coverage at nzherald.co.nz. The Front Page is hosted and produced by me, Chelsea Daniels. Kane Dickey is our studio operator, Richard Martin, our producer and editor, and our executive producer is Jane Yee. Follow The Front Page on the iHeart app or wherever you get your podcasts, and join us next time for another look beyond the headlines.